Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Evan Verplu, and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. The IRC is an education-based nonprofit, and we center crucial skills like empathy, media literacy, and active listening to bridge differences of opinion and promote informed civil discourse around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. We hold the mission of increasing our global acumen and encouraging civic responsibility. We're so pleased to partner with the wonderful presenting organizations this year of the 2024 China Town Hall. We have the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, the United States Heartland China Association, the KU Center for East Asian Studies alongside us here at the IRC, who are presenting this year's local China Town Hall. The Chinatown Hall very much exemplifies what we hold dear at the IRC, which is thought-provoking dialogue about issues that impact each and every one of us. We do hope you'll visit us at our website, irckc.org, to learn more about the International Relations Council, including information about membership, our upcoming events, and the long history of us as a Kansas City organization. Also encourage you to visit the websites of the other presenting partners of today's program, because each and every one of them do a ton of work to promote a really strong dialogue around these issues. So I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Dr. Jack Zhang, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. He received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at UC San Diego. And his dissertation examines when and why economically interdependent countries use military versus economic coercion in foreign policy disputes. In 2018-2019, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governments at Princeton University. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Evan, and such a pleasure to cooperate with the IRC, and this year for the first time, the U.S. Heartland China Association on our Chinatown Hall. We also have a twofer this year. This is the second Chinatown Hall we're doing this academic year. I think in future, this event's going to be pushed to this spring time slot. But let me begin by saying a few things about the Center for East Asian Studies, and then to introduce our speaker for today. So the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas is a major academic hub and premier resource for East Asian studies on the Great Plains region. It's composed of 60 plus faculty members across 25 departments. And again, really, happy for this partnership to work with the IRC to bring you this year's Chinatown Hall yet again. We are delighted to have a fantastic speaker as our local speaker this year. Dr. Ketian Zhang is an assistant professor of international security in the Scar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. She is one of the emerging experts on Chinese foreign policy and economic statecraft, and sort of China's use of coercion. And I've been a big fan of her work for a really long time, and was delighted to have her acquire a copy of her recent newly off the press book from Cambridge University Press, China's Gambit, The Calculus of Coercion, which is what Dr. Zhang will be presenting to us today. Ketian received her PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she is a proud Wisconsin Badger from her bachelor's days. And also, I admire and commiserate with Ketian, because she's also a mother of a young child, and I don't know how she finds all the time to do the excellent research that she does. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Zhang. This session is being recorded, will be posted on the YouTube page of the Center for East Asian Studies later. And I would encourage audience members to please, as you have questions that come up, please use the Q&A feature to ask them. I will try to curate them and read them and pose it to Dr. Zhang following her book talk. All right, without further ado, over to you, Ketian.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Jack Zhang, for the kind introduction. To answer your very nice question, my husband is a preschool teacher, so I outsource all of my motherly duties to my husband. So Thanks so much again for having me here. So let me share my slides and hopefully all of you can see my slides all right. So I'll start my timer. So today I'm going to be presenting my book titled China's Gambits, The Calculus of Coercion. So let's begin by taking a look at a data set of China's coercion that I collected from 1990 to 2020. So the gray bars that you see here are coded as coercion. And by coercion, I mean the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. So we can see that over the past 3 decades, the frequency of China's coercion has been on the rise, which is not surprising given how much power China has grown over the years. But what's more interesting to me is that when we look at the tools of China's coercion, there's actually a variation. So same figure, but broken down into different kinds of coercive tools. The blue bars here are cases of military coercion and orange bars cases of non-military coercion. So we can see that in the 1990s, China used military coercion about half of the time. An example would be the missile testing over the Taiwan Strait, because Taiwan is considered one of the core interests of China. And beginning 2000s, we're seeing an increase of China's coercion overall, but interestingly, China has been overwhelmingly utilizing non-militarized coercive tools in lieu of military coercion. An example is the banana ban that China imposed against Filipino banana exports to China over maritime disputes in the South China Sea in 2012, an example of economic sanctions. And another example is the use of gray zone coercion. So in this picture, you're seeing the Chinese maritime surveillance ships, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ships, ramming a Vietnamese vessel also over disputes in the South China Sea. And this is a form of gray zone coercion. So there's variation over the tools of China's coercion. And in addition, another aspect of China's coercion that also puzzles me as a scholar is the targets of China's coercion. So as you'll see, we're going to talk about the South China Sea a lot today. So let's stick with this South China Sea theme and take a look at an internal map that I got from the Chinese Academy of Sciences when I was doing fieldwork a couple years back. And the whitish area, as you can see in the middle, is the South China Sea. And China has maritime territorial disputes and sovereignty disputes in the South China Sea with several Southeast Asian countries. So the black dashed line that you see here is what's called China's nine dash line. So China essentially claims all of the land features as well as maritime rights from within the nine dash line. And towards your bottom, you're going to see some orange dots, and these are Malaysian oil fields, and there are a lot of them from within the nine dash line. And to your right, you're going to see one single purple dot, and that's the Philippine oil field. And there's only one within the nine dash line. Now, what I want you to do, if it's possible, is for you to enter into the chat function here on Zoom about this question of these two countries, Malaysia and the Philippines, which of them would China be coercing more harshly and frequently? So I would love to hear or just see chats answers in the chat function about whether you vouch for Malaysia or the Philippines. So I'll just stop for 20 seconds, maybe, for some of you who might be entering your answers, Team Malaysia or Team Philippines.
We have one guess on the Philippines.
Yay.
My guess as well. But
Well, it seems that there are a lot of answers. So I'm just gonna not look at them, and I'll show you the results. So let me preface by saying that I was Team Malaysia when I was looking at this map initially because of how many oil fields Malaysia has within the nine dash line. But I was wrong, unfortunately. So for those of you who entered the Philippines, you actually won. China coerced the Philippines a lot more harshly and frequently than it does with regard to Malaysia. So I was wrong. And this variation over the tools and targets of China's coercion led me to answer this, or try to answer this central question of this book, which is when, why, and how does China coerce when faced with perceived threats to its national security? So in the book, I offered the cost balancing theory to examine China's coercion and placing coercion in an era of global economic interdependence, and argue for 3 things. And first, I argue that China coerces one target state in order to deter other states from doing similar things that it does not like in the future. And second, I argue that coercion is more likely when the need to establish a reputation for resolve is high, but the economic cost of coercing the target state is low. And by the need to establish a reputation for resolve, I mean concerns about appearing weak or showing weakness to the other states if no coercive action is used. And finally, I would argue that China prefers to use non-militarized coercive tools when the geopolitical cost is high. In other words, China is concerned about the dispute escalating into a militarized confrontation if military coercion is used. And this oftentimes leads China to adopt Goldilocks choices, that is, using coercion, but for fear of escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to first talk about or define what I mean by coercion a little bit more in detail and explain the theory a little bit more comprehensively as well, and then talk about mostly the sources that I use for the book. So I'll skip over the research design, so I promise no, jargons, and then use several empirical cases in the South China Sea to illustrate the arguments in the book, and finally conclude and talk about the policy implications. So in line with the literature, I define coercion as the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. In particular, I'm looking at actions in the literature which is referred to as compellence, that is to compel or to force the other state to do things that they otherwise would not have wanted to do. So there's a full spectrum of coercive tools that states, including China, can utilize. And the first kind could be diplomatic sanctions. An example of that would be canceling senior level meetings between China and the target state, or more extremely, embassy closure or cutting ties completely. And the second kind of tool that states can impose or utilize would be economic sanctions. And the banana ban that we just saw in the beginning would be an example, but more extremely, states can adopt embargoes as well. So what straddles these strictly non-military and military coercion is what I call gray zone coercion. So it is the use or threats of civilian law enforcement organizations to inflict potential physical damage on the target state. And China's use of its maritime surveillance ships or the Coast Guard ships to ram into the foreign vessels in the South China Sea would be an example. And finally, states can escalate to military coercion. So China's missile testing and military exercises off of the Taiwan Strait would be an example. Now that we've talked about the concept, let's get to the theory a little bit more in detail. So the underlying assumption of the book, as well as a lot of my research, is that in an era of global economic interdependence, coercion decisions are a result of balancing security and economic factors. And the book answers two questions. First, when and why China coerces, and second, what tools is more or less likely to utilize when it does decide to coerce. So let's get to the one question first. So here I argue that because states balance between external security as well as economic concerns, so on the one hand, they might want to use coercion in order to demonstrate to the other states that it is committed and strong and resolved to defend its national security interests. And states might fear that if no coercive action or threat is used, then other states might view inaction of the state, coercing state, as unresolved and weak. So this might push states to use coercion or to choose coercion. But on the other hand, coercion does carry with it costs. And I would argue that the primary cost is economic. Because, for example, China is an economically integrated state and is part of the global production and supply chains, then it has to take into consideration the potential negative economic consequences of using coercion. For example, the target state might retaliate economically or through other means, and trade between China and other states might be interrupted if coercion is used. And therefore, that's why there is this cost balancing logic in terms of China's coercion decisions. And I argue first that China will need to decide the level of the need to establish resolve. And if the need is low, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion. But when the need to establish resolve is high, China will then need to consider the economic cost of coercing the target state. So when the economic cost is low, we're more likely to see China using coercion. Now, you might be wondering, what about the circumstances when the need to establish resolve and economic costs are both high? How does China decide? So I would argue that in these circumstances, the issue importance variable comes into play. So by issue importance, I mean the states attached to certain issues. For example, in the case of China, empirically, there's a strictly defined interest hierarchy, with Taiwan and Tibet being the core interests, and other issues such as maritime disputes, the things that we're going to be talking about today, they're important, but they're not at the level of core interests. So I argue it's only when the issue is about the core interest that we're more likely to see China using coercion, and when the issue importance is lower, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion when the need to establish resolve and economic costs are both high. So in the book, especially the chapter on Taiwan, I talked a lot about issue importance, but for today, we're going to be zooming in on cases where the need to establish resolve and economic cost are not both high. Now, let's turn to the second part of the question, which is about the tools of China's coercion. So here, I argue that geopolitical backlash cost explains when China uses non-militarized coercive tools. And the logic here is that because China is concerned about the potential that other states might balance against itself by forming alliances or strengthening alliances with other states, especially great powers such as the United States, then when the geopolitical cost is high, we're more likely to see China using non-militarized coercion, because China fears that the use of military coercion might draw in external great powers with whom the target state has mutual defense treaties with, for example, the United States. And that might escalate the dispute into a militarized confrontation, which China does not like. So as a result, it's only when the geopolitical backlash cost is lower that we're more likely to see China using military coercion. And that, I would say, applies a lot of to the Sino-Indian land border dispute cases. So this ends the discussion of the theory itself. Let's now take a look at some of the sources that I utilize, for the book. Well, here we go. What you're seeing here is a pile of books about 30 pounds that I hauled from China after a trip to China in spring 2023. On top of it is a red study notebook for the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress. And of course, Ketian didn't use any of these books for the book on coercion per se. I'm using these for some of my more recent research, but I do utilize primary Chinese language sources of several kinds. So let me give you some examples here. And the first example would be official sources, basically from the Chinese government. So on the left-hand side, for example, is a book titled China's Foreign Affairs, published by the Chinese Foreign Ministry annually, going all the way back to 1987. And on the right-hand side would be a secret document from the Central International Liaison Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And I did not steal this document from China. It's actually available at the Government Library at George Washington University, which has a lot of wonderful resources on China. And the second kind of source I utilize would be semi-official sources. For example, documents and reports from Chinese government think tanks. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing an internal report from the Chinese National Institute for South China Sea Studies. And on the right-hand side would be some internal analysis from the Chinese Navy that I gained access to when I was doing field work a couple years back prior to the pandemic in China. And finally, I was able to cross-check the aforementioned sources with interviews I've done over the years. So I've done about 152 interviews, and 45% of them were with Chinese government analysts, and about a quarter were with former diplomats and officials, and 6% were with former military officials, and 25% were with well-connected Chinese scholars who sometimes brief central leaders, including Xi Jinping. So these interviews are useful because they provide a specific knowledge about the case that I'm interested in, but I also use them to cross-check against other sources so that I'm not biased towards one source over another. So this concludes my discussion of the sources. Now let's turn to hopefully what's more interesting, that is the empirics in the book. Like I said earlier, we're going to be focusing on the South China Sea. So let's take a look at Figure 2, which tracks data about the South China Sea, specifically challenges from other disputes in the South China Sea from 1990 to 2020. And the blue bars here are coded as incidents, by which I mean actions taken by other disputes in the South China Sea. And it's important to note that these incidents are not necessarily actions that tilt the military balance of power in the South China Sea to China's disadvantage, and oftentimes these are actions that are designed to strengthen the administrative control and claims of the other disputes in the South China Sea, for example, Malaysia, among other states. And China views these actions, however minor they are, as diminishing China's own sovereignty claims and administrative control over the rocks in the South China Sea. So let me give you some concrete examples. In the 1990s, you're seeing this little bump here, and they tend to include examples such as Vietnam occupying a new land feature in the South China Sea. And in between 2000 and 2005 or so, you're seeing a slight decrease. And these tend to include examples that are way more demure and much less dramatic than compared to the actions in the 1990s. And one example is a Malaysian politician landing on a land feature that it has already occupied since the 1990s. And beginning 2007, you're seeing a slight increase again in terms of these incidents. And these tend to include actions such as, for example, the Philippines signing an oil and gas contract with a foreign company in the South China Sea. So this is the same figure, but I added China's coercion in response to some of these incidents in red. And we can see that in the 1990s, China used coercion from time to time, although I do want to emphasize that China actually doesn't use coercion every time there is an incident that China considers as threatening to its sovereignty, right? So China is very cautious and selective in terms of when to use coercion. And some of the cases of China's coercion in the 1990s were actually militarized. And in between 2000 and 2006 or so, China refrained from coercion. And beginning 2007, we're seeing China using coercion again, and again selectively, not responding to every single incident. And none of the post-2007 cases of China's coercion were militarized. So in the book, I looked at the temporal trends of China's patterns of coercion and demonstrate that the temporal trends is in line with the temporal changes of the variables that we talked about earlier. But for the talk, just for illustration purposes, let me introduce two cases. And the first one is the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident between China and the Philippines, where China used coercion. And interestingly, the exact same incident took place in 2001, also again over the Scarborough Shoal, where the only difference is that China refrained from coercion in that case. So let's take a look at 2012 to see why China used coercion in this case. So as you can see, the Scarborough Shoal is this little red dot in the South China Sea, and that China and the Philippines both claim to be its own territory. And in April 2012, Chinese fishermen tried to fish in this disputed waters, and they were arrested by the Filipino Navy vessel. And China used several kinds of coercive tools in response. And the first one is that China used its maritime surveillance ships, again, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ship, to blockade Philippine Navy vessels from entry into the Scarborough Shoal, such that they came to a standoff. And secondly, China imposed the banana ban that we discussed earlier, a form of economic sanctions. And finally, China also imposed diplomatic sanctions by not meeting with senior Filipino counterparts for at least 6 months. And it's important to know that these three forms of coercive tools were all non-militarized. So the goals of China's coercion in this case were twofold, with the direct goal being forcing the Philippines to withdraw, but the broader goal in terms of forcing a restraint on all South China Sea disputes. So my argument is that the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but the economic cost of coercing the Philippines was low. So let's take a look at why I argue that the need to establish resolve vis-a-vis the Philippines was high in this case. So there are several pieces of evidence to suggest that, and first is that prior to China using coercion in 2012, there was an increased number of actions taken by the Philippines and other South China Sea disputes, the little blue bars that you see earlier, and these actions themselves were heavily reported through international media exposure. So the logic to China's concern here is that there were more actions, increase of them, that China considers as threatening to China's sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, and these incidents were heavily reported internationally. So China fears that if no coercive action is taken, then other states are all observing these incidents as well as watching China's response or lack thereof. And if China does not use coercion, then other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved and weak and might take further actions in the future. And this applies to the Scarborough Shoal incident itself. So let's take a look at a photo. Up front, you'll see some Chinese fishermen, and the gentleman in the back was the Philippine Navy personnel. And this photo was taken by the Philippine Navy and was released to the AFP prior to China using coercion, adding to China's pressure to establish resolve because of the media exposure. So I also look at primary Chinese language sources to indicate that the logic of establishing resolve indeed was crucial to China's use of coercion in this 2012 case. So this is one source from Zhang at People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party papers, Communist Party's official party paper in February 2012, that noted that if the Philippines viewed China's push for cooperation as a sign of weakness, the Philippines had the wrong calculus. So here China was concerned about being viewed as weak by especially the Philippines. And similarly, the same source noted again during China's coercion that the Philippines should not view China as weak, and China could create a Scarborough model to stop the opponent and deter future transgressions. So here, the logic of using coercion to establish resolve to deter future actions is pretty clear. And also, these two pieces of sources took place before and during China's coercion, so it's not post-hoc justification of China's behavior. And finally, I was able to utilize interviews with former senior Chinese officials, and the consensus among them was that, and they used this ancient Chinese proverb to describe their logic, which is China feared being viewed as weak and wanted to kill the chicken in order to scare the monkeys. So here the Philippines was the chicken, and other South China Sea spoons were the monkeys. But I think it's better framed as to scare the chicken in order to scare other monkeys. But please don't ask me the relationship between the chickens and the monkeys in the Q&A. I don't know why they're related. It's just ancient Chinese wisdom that draws a lot of analogies from the zoo. So the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but in contrast, the economic cost for China to coerce the Philippines was low. So figure 3 here tracks Sino-Philippine trade as a total share of Chinese foreign trade from 1993 to 2014. The blue line is percent of China's exports, red line imports. So we can see that if you look at the y-axis, Sino-Philippine trade constituted as a very small amount of overall Chinese foreign trade, at best about 2.5%, more recently is usually less than 1%. And in contrast, and Chinese officials knew well before coercion that Sino-Philippine trade was highly asymmetrical to China's advantage. So by 2012, Sino-Philippine trade constituted about 30% of overall Philippine trade, but only 0.9% for China. And as a result, Chinese officials decided that it was in China's advantage to impose sanctions on the Philippines. Now, let's move on to the second part of the question, which is about why China did not use militarized coercion in this case. All of China's coercive tools were non-militarized. And I argue that that's because of the high geopolitical backlash cost. And I'll skip over some of the temporal pieces of evidence here, but just to summarize by saying that China has been viewing the geopolitical backlash of using military coercion in the South China Sea as high because of, interestingly, U.S. counterterrorism efforts since the early 2000s, which increased U.S. military presence in Southeast Asia that China considers as threatening, and therefore it wants to avoid militarized escalation. And including in this trend or concerns about geopolitical backlash manifests itself also in some of the interviews that I've done with former Chinese officials. One of them mentions that if China used military coercion in 2012, the U.S. Navy might be directly involved. And as a result, we're seeing China adopting the Goldilocks choices, right? That is using coercion, but to avoid escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. And interestingly, in contrast, China did not use coercion in 2001, even though Chinese fishermen were arrested by the Filipino Navy vessel at that time as well. And I would argue, and again very briefly, that the main argument has to do with the low need to establish resolve in 2001, because there weren't as many incidents or actions that China deemed as threatening back in 2001 as compared to 2012, and the level of international media exposure was much lower in 2001 as well. And former deputy Chinese foreign minister also confirmed this logic as well. And finally, before we conclude, let me get to the question of why Team Malaysia lost very briefly, because I think some of you might be on Team Malaysia earlier. So again, the difference between Malaysia and the Philippines is that the need to establish resolve was low regarding Malaysia, but high with regard to the Philippines for several reasons. So first, Chinese interviewees noted that the Philippines is the loudest in internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea, putting China's pressure to establish resolve on the line, whereas for them, Malaysia is the smart one because it is silently making profits off of the South China Sea without internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea issue. And as a result, China fears that if China does not use coercion against the Philippines, other states might imitate the Philippines' behavior in the future because it's highly salient and highly exposed through the international media. So to briefly conclude, the book examines when, why, and how China coerces, and then argue that China oftentimes adopts Goldilocks choices, that is, balancing between the need to establish resolve and the economic cost of coercing the target state, and thinking also about the geopolitical backlash cost. And this suggests that a globalized economy provides both opportunities and constraints for rising powers' behavior, including China's coercive action. And second, coercion oftentimes is used by China as a signaling device, that is, killing the chicken to scare the monkey, or scaring the chicken to scare the monkey for that matter. And third, the book also adds to the interesting literature that increasingly emphasizes non-traditional forms of coercion, including gray zone coercion, which travels beyond China to countries such as Iran, Russia, among other states. And finally, I would also like to say that linear power growth is an important variable when it comes to explaining rising power behavior, but is insufficient in explaining rising power behavior. We do need to look at other factors, including economic factors, as well as concerns about resolve. And as for policy implications for the United States, two brief policy implications. And the first one is that I would argue for a quiet rebalancing strategy for the Indo-Pacific. What that means is more actions, less talk. Because oftentimes, without too much media publicity, it'll reduce the China's pressure to establish resolve. So, for example, in the maritime realm, the United States could engage in more frequent and regularized freedom of navigation operations. And second, I would argue that the United States will have more targeted economic leverage by keeping China in the global production and supply chains instead of completely decoupling from China, because that way the United States can keep China continuously vulnerable and dependent on key technologies and products from the United States, which increases the leverage that the United States can have vis-a-vis China. So thank you so much again for having me, and I look forward to the conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ketian. Fantastic presentation. And I'm going to drop some links into the chat here, beginning with a link to Ketian's book. Please order your own copy, leave a good review, and all that. As I mentioned earlier, this discussion is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the Center for East Asian Studies YouTube channel, which I also include a link of. And Ketian is also part of a speaker series that I run at the KU Trade War Lab. So if you like topics like this on economic statecraft, do tune in and join our speaker series. But I'm going to encourage audience members to please use the Q&A feature, enter your questions. We already have a couple that I'm going to begin to weave together into a discussion here for Ketian. So we have a question from Greg here that builds on something that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is putting China's sort of use of economic coercion, or coercion in general, military and economic, in comparative context. How does it differ from coercive behavior of the United States, for example? In what ways does your, I guess, cost balancing theory, the academic terms, right, explain sort of other cases of instrument choice in statecraft?
Right. That is a great question. So I think the question is sort of like a two-pronged, right? Jack asked about a question about more like generalizability. Does it travel beyond China? And Greg asked about sort of comparison in terms of practice between China and the United States. I think to the first question on comparing China and the United States, there might be several differences. And the first one is that I don't have the complete data, but I think the United States, on average, both historically and at the present, might use military coercion a little bit more proportionally than compared to China. And that I think might have to do with the fact that the United States is a hegemon, and there might be a lot of power asymmetry between the United States and the target state that the United States is using military coercion on, including, for example, Vietnam. Whereas in the case of China, a lot of the coercive targets that China engages in will tend to include states that are relatively well-developed, or OECD countries, for example, Japan, Germany, and France, etc. And again, I think the difference really has to do with economic concerns. And the second difference, in addition to the frequency to use military coercion, is that even in a practice of non-militarized coercive tools, for example, economic sanctions, I have an article that's forthcoming in another journal that compares or contrasts the U.S. sanctions behavior, which tends to be public and formal. U.S. sanctions tend to go through, for example, Congress, and it's announced by the president, et cetera, et cetera. But in contrast, in a data set that I've collected about China's economic sanctions from 1990 to 2023, 87% of Chinese economic sanctions tend to be what's called vague or informal sanctions, including the banana ban, right? So the banana ban that I introduced earlier was announced by the Chinese, I think, Bureau of Quality Inspection and Control, and it was not framed as an economic sanctions episode. Instead, China just said that Philippine bananas, there are pests in the bananas, so we're going to stop them from coming into the Chinese ports, even though the timing of that ban lined up perfectly with the standoff over the Scarborough Shoal. It's very clear that it's using the ban as a form of economic sanctions, but it's never formally or publicly announced. And the argument I would say is that it's partially because of China's concerns about international institutional constraints, for example, WTO rules. Because in those cases, China cannot plausibly argue that its ban is based on essential national security interests. Taiwan might be China's national security interest, essential interest, but those little rocks in the South China Sea certainly do not count as critical or essential national security interest. So because of that, China is fearful of any violation of WTO rules, but it still wants to impose economic sanctions. Therefore, it uses these informal and vague economic sanctions. So I think that's the two major differences that I see between China's coercion and coercion by the United States. And in terms of Jack's question on generalizability, that's a great question. So I don't really have any additional research at the moment in detail that completely matches on to another state's practice of coercion per se. But I would say in these like components of the cost dimension theory, we do see generalizability beyond China. So for example, concerns about geopolitical backlash, I think we could say that Russian use of gray zone activities, not necessarily coercion, but gray zone tactics in general, is sort of like a response or concern about NATO escalation. So I think your colleague Eric Gartsky and Andreas Gannon and John Lindsay have a really interesting article, I think last year, that argues that Russia uses gray zone because it's concerned about NATO escalation. So I think there is some similarity there. And as for the need to establish resolve, I think we're seeing even more similarities with both in terms of smaller powers, but also great powers. For example, I think some scholars would argue that the United States engages in war in the Middle East to send a message to allies as well as adversaries around the world that it's strong and committed to defend its interests. So that is sort of like I guess, killing the chicken to scare the monkey kind of dynamic. And others would argue that some of Israel's behavior would also demonstrate this established resolve kind of a dynamic. So I would say there is a level of generalizability, but I haven't really studied the coercion practice of other states in detail.
Really exciting, I think, emerging area of research of the comparative sanctions. And I think I know the background story, in case audience members are curious, behind the killing chickens to scare monkeys things. Is like in ancient China, when they're training monkeys, they're pretty smart. So the idea is you kill a chicken in front of them so that they learn that you're serious. So then they're more more, behave better to the trainer. At least that's what I have heard about that saying. But to continue the Q&A, I'm gonna ask, I guess, two more questions about the South China Sea, and then we'll talk about domestic politics, and then we'll talk a little bit maybe about research design or research sort of access if we have time. So there's an anonymous question about basically what does China, does China want to dominate the South China Sea, right? Does it want to, and therefore it's targeting loud, competitors and neighbors? What's the end goal there? And then Hank has a question about whether China's island building is a form of coercion in your view. Let's tackle these two.
Sure. Yeah, those are really great questions. I think the audience is very informed, maybe more so than me. So on to the question of I guess China's ultimate goals in the South China Sea. First off, I don't think China's ultimate goal is to, say, dominate the South China Sea per se. In terms of these territorial disputes, what China really wants to gain eventually is to gain sovereignty control over those rocks in the South China Sea, because the South China Sea has a lot of rocks. Maybe I think over 50 of them. China controls about 9 of them in the Spratly Islands and all of the parasols, and other countries, for example, Vietnam actually controls a lot more land features, 29 of them in the South China Sea. So China really wants to regain, I guess, in a way, or ultimately, not as of now, the territory, the land features in the South China Sea, and in addition, the maritime rights, for example, oil and gas drilling rights, among other things in the South China Sea. I don't think it really wants to say gain dominance. And as of now, I don't think the Chinese military has the capability to maintain or gain dominance in the South China Sea either. So if you look at the writings of Chinese government analysts as well as military scholars, they'll say that the PLA Navy as of now has a lot of shortcomings in terms of what they call far sea combat operation capabilities. And the South China Sea is part of China's near seas, but it's at the same time operational wise is really more of like the far sea setting. And the PLA doesn't really have any, I think, capability to dominate the South China Sea. And one of our colleagues, Dr. Fiona Cunningham at UPenn, has a really interesting article in which she argues that in a hypothetical campaign analysis scenario, the United States, with allies' help, for example, South Korea or Japan, could actually impose a blockade against China in the South China Sea. So in a way that shows that, and the Chinese, I think, officials were rational enough to know that it's really impossible for China to dominate the South China Sea at the moment. And I don't think it's also the goal either. And related to the question on island building, that's a perfect segue to another paper, an article that I wrote. So originally the island building part, the land reclamation is part of the dissertation, but I eventually decided to check that part out, partially because land reclamation is a different kind of phenomena. Of course, it's not entirely peaceful, but at the same time, it's not the direct kind of coercion in response to an incident that China does not like. So China uses that kind of the 2012 Scarborough Shoal kind of dynamic in order to force stop the behavior of the other states. So island building or land reclamation, with the sources that I have, is really more for logistical resupply purposes, which again feeds back to my earlier point about the shortcomings of the PLA Navy in the South China Sea. So a lot of the land reclamation are used for economic logistical purposes, but also logistical resupply for the PLA, because the PLA Navy doesn't have other kind of bases in the area, which makes it really difficult for Chinese surface ships to, say, patrol continuously, etc. So land reclamation, I don't think is direct coercion. It's more of a broader deterrence kind of action.
Thank you, Ketian. Now, turning to a question from my colleague, Professor John Kennedy. So your theory has a lot to do with the international factors, right? Shaping China's decision to coerce. Can you talk a little bit about domestic sort of politics, the audience, and maybe nationalism as factors that influence China's decision to coerce? Thank you.
Yeah. Should I take more questions, or do you think we still have time? To answer, sorry, I can answer the one by one, right?
Right. I think so. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
sounds great. That's a great question. I did consider nationalism as one potential alternative hypotheses in the book. And of course, I do, and also considered individual leaders. So I guess by domestic, we could probably focus or at least discuss nationalism and the role of individual leaders. So let me get to nationalism first. I think it's an important factor to consider. And I think colleagues like Andrew Chubb, Dr. Andrew Chubb has done a lot on sort of public opinions and maritime disputes. But at the same time, I don't think coercion decisions are entirely driven by domestic nationalistic kind of impulses for several reasons. And the first one is that if we argue that there is sort of a nationalistic and sentiment driving China's coercion decisions in the South China Sea, we will not necessarily see a divergence between more coercion on the Philippines and less coercion on the Malaysians, because I don't think there's a distinct anti-Philippines nationalism in China, right? So if you think nationalism drives Chinese coercion in the South China Sea, we might see a relatively stable frequency of coercion in with regard to these different countries of disputes in the South China Sea, not so much of a drastic difference between the Malaysians and the Philippines. And second is that I think if nationalism drives coercion decisions, we might see more or less of like a stable occurrences of coercion over time, not so much of this like cyclical coercion in the 1990s, no coercion, and then non-military coercion post 2007 in the temporal sense. And if anything, some of my at least some of my sources would suggest that if the Chinese public drives coercion decisions, we might be seeing more military coercion in the South China Sea. So in the post-2007 period, some Chinese netizens actually criticized the Chinese government for being too soft on disputes in the South China Sea, right? Because China mainly uses non-military coercion to avoid escalation, but they're criticized, the Chinese government was criticized by the Chinese citizens for being too soft on the Philippines. So that's why I don't think nationalism was the driving factor of China's coercion calculus. And as for other kinds of domestic factors, say the leaders, individual leaders, I think overall the trend of China's coercion patterns in the past 3 decades suggest that there isn't that much of a difference even after Xi Jinping comes into power. So I don't, and especially since if we expect Xi Jinping to have a asymmetrical kind of influence on coercion patterns, we might be seeing assertive leaders to use military coercion more. But instead, I think in the 1990s, China, in terms of proportion, China actually used military coercion a lot more, right, than compared to the current period. So individual leaders, I think it's important, but I don't think it's like the driving factor of China's coercion. And finally, very briefly, some might argue that since we're talking about domestic factors, the role of bureaucracies, those mid-ranking, I guess, rank and file officials, and what are their roles in China's coercion, by and large. And here we're talking about coercion decisions, not the implementation of coercion. I would say coercion decisions are very much centralized at the central decision-making level. And there are internal documents that I gathered from the PLA, Navy, and the Chinese State Oceanic Administration, which used to control the Coast Guards and the maritime surveillance ships, and they were very clearly defined modules and plans about how Chinese Coast Guard ships were supposed to behave when it comes to encountering like a foreign vessel. And every sort of such encounter will need to be reported one level up all the way to the central government. So the Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012, for example, was elevated all the way to the Politburo Standing Committee, which then had, I think, 2 rounds of meetings and then made decisions about when and whether and how to take coercive actions. There was one outlier, and I happened to interview the person who was involved in that. So that was a captain at the local level of the Chinese Coast Guard, and acted basically without any authorization from the central Chinese government in one instance in maritime disputes. And the end result of him was that he was forced to resign from his post. So in a way, we're seeing the central government using a domestic killing the chicken to scare the monkey kind of dynamic to ensure that all mid-ranking, officials and bureaucracies sort of follow suit, right, with regard to coercion decisions. But one thing to note at the end is that I think it's one thing to talk about coercion decisions, which tends to be centralized more so at the central government level. But at the same time, if we're talking about implementation of coercive decisions and the level of success, there's a lot more variation where local actors, bureaucracies have a lot of leeway. So Dr. Audrey Wan, who was the presenter earlier 2 weeks ago, had a lot of just work that focuses on how local officials, local bureaucracies might have an impact on the success of Chinese economic statecraft. And similarly, Dr. Casey Mimura at the University of San Diego has written a really interesting article about under what circumstances local Chinese economic actors as well as officials can actually, I guess, defy the sanctions decisions made by the central government if they have a lot of economic interest in continuously trading with the target state.
Wonderful, thank you. Really rich answer. I think that would satisfy a dissertation defense committee. I think you also addressed a little bit of CW's question here about whether you're dividing coercion by decades or administrations. I think your book is actually structured around particular dyadic sort of topics, right? So it's not either, my understanding is not either by decade or by administration. And you spoke a little bit, I think, to whether C is sort of the changing factor. I did have a question sort of related on this, which is choices of what made it into the book and what is not. And one that I think about a lot is the THAAD case, right, that Audrey also writes about. So South Korea, and that's one where the economic relations are actually really strong. But then they coerced, I would say unsuccessfully, right? But they chose to engage in economic coercion. So do you have any thoughts really quick on that case? And then I think time for one last question about sort of the research, your research access. Yeah.
Sure. So I have some thoughts on that. I mean, that's a very valid point. So the THAAD case, I think didn't make it into the main sort of chapters, mainly because I was focusing, I guess, on the issues that are most important to China. So I guess according to the interest hierarchy, Taiwan, Tibet, and territorial disputes, those all together are part of China's concerns for territorial integrity, but they, in and of themselves, those rocks are not China's core interests. But like human rights issues, like for example, the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Liu Xiaobo, or the THAAD cases, I think are cases that I discuss a little bit more so in the concluding section, just because they're they're of, I guess, the third category in terms of importance to the Chinese government, and I think by and large it sort of still can be or applies to the cost balancing theory. So on the one hand, I think that the THAAD case really is a case of killing the chicken to scare the monkey, not necessarily say Japan per se, but more so to deter South Korea from maybe inviting another battery of THAAD in the future. And as for economic relations, I mean, I agree that South Korea is still very important to China, as similar to what Japan is. But at the same time, I think the long-term trend over the past 30 years is that trade between China and South Korea and trade between China and Japan, they tend to be more balanced than in the 1990s. So I guess we could argue that the economic cost, it's still there. It's just less pronounced than compared to the 1990s, because there are cases in the 1990s where China refrained from coercion against Japan over similar issues, but because of acute concerns about economic costs. So I think by and large, it still applies to the theory in the book.
Great, thank you. And I think we're going to conclude with one last question, which is actually the first question that came in about whether these are increasingly sensitive topics, right? And somebody was wondering whether you're allowed to travel freely to China and Hong Kong, I guess, for research for this book and also subsequent to its publication. What do you think is happening there?
That
And then
that
we'll
is
wrap
a
with
that's a very good question. And I guess I am traveling to China in the summer, so we'll test, hopefully you all see me back at some point. And if not, I guess that is an answer to what you just asked. So most of my research though on this book were done well before the pandemic, where access was increasingly narrower than compared to I think the early 2000s or the golden years, but you can still have access to like certain people. I think my understanding, talking to some of the Chinese scholars who have traveled more recently here in the U.S., especially San Francisco, for conferences, etc., is that at least in the scholarly community, there isn't that much of there's less political correctness. Their point is that you're fine if you go visit or give talks in like Chinese universities. But of course, it does mean that I need to be a little bit more, I guess, cautious myself. When traveling to China, I don't think that in subsequent research I can get the same level of access that I did, say 7 years ago. There are a lot of people that I interviewed that I don't think I will interview just because of I think safety concerns, but also for their safety too. But my more recent research has evolved a little bit more, so maybe closer to Dr. Jack Zhang's realm, which tends to be less directly sensitive. So it's not about coercion per se. So I'm more interested in brand strategy more recently. So I guess that might potentially reduce the sensitivity of some of the research. But of course, again, I'll put it to test when I visit China in the summer.
And the realm of what's sensitive is growing wider and wider, sadly. But unfortunately, this is all the time we have. Thank you so much for a really rich and informative talk. And congratulations again on the book. I'm going to turn over things to Jason Connolly, representing the U.S. Heartland China Association shortly. But as you see in the chat, this is an event that's flagship event of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and they have a national live stream speaker as well, Dr. Kurt Campbell, and that recording is going to be on YouTube. So the video link is there in the chat for those who are interested. But over to Jason for the last word. Thank you again, Ketian.
Okay, well, thank you, Jack. And again, thank you to Ketian for such a wonderful overview of your book. As someone who personally studied the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese economic power geopolitically in their graduate degree, I'm personally very motivated by your book and your work. Very inspiring. I think that listening to the two of you talk about Chinese strength and political power in a geographical sense is an important topic. Has become increasingly important in the past few years. And I think as we look forward to the remainder of 2024, will continue to be very important. So I'll be curious to see if Deputy Secretary Campbell mentions that in his remarks tonight as we move into that. I just did want to introduce my organization really briefly and thank the International Relations Council as well as the University of Kansas for making this event possible. I work for the U.S. Heartland China Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. These themes of Chinese strength, geopolitical ties are questions that we answer every day in our work. We focus more on the Heartland region, which I imagine for a lot of our audience here working with IRC, University of Kansas, that would appeal to you. So we focus on the Heartland region as opposed to our coasts and navigating this U.S.-China relationship and exploring how we work better in the Midwest and the Heartland to improve our relationship with China. One way that we do that is through agriculture and agricultural business. So we will be taking a major delegation to China this June, which we're very excited about. So if anyone in our audience does work in agriculture or is interested in learning more, just check out our website. Feel free to shoot me a message. But again, I'm looking forward to the next hour of our program, where we'll hear a little bit more about Chinese strength, Chinese political power, and more from a national level, how the U.S. views those things. So thank you so much to our audience again, and Ketian for a wonderful overview, and Jack for being such a great moderator.
Wonderful. That's a wrap. Thank you so much, Jason, Evan, Ketian. Great event. Please, thank you to the audience members, and do look out for these future events coming up and for the recording of this talk in the YouTube channel, the Center for East Asian Studies at KU. All right. Thank you. Take care. Again, the link to the national broadcast we just put into the chat here. So do join us also for watching Dr. Kirk Campbell's national address. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Jack.